Our next subject of discussion will be intellectual property and some corporate entities that turn intellectual property into this draconian pursuit of ordinary users of media that just try to perhaps be a little bit creative or even to obtain some entertainment or use technology in the way that they please.
We will also discuss companies that tend to oppress other companies in a similar fashion. Not just consumers that are damaged by these kinds of intellectual property laws, but also the patent system and defensive patenting that damages companies that might care to innovate, but are prevented from doing so by vested interests in the industry.
And it's interesting, the default term for what we're doing...
Well, you may have noticed that we're not calling this show a podcast.
Yes. And this was Wendy's decision. My first impulse was to revert to that default term.
Well, it's become part of the language.
However, because it's been appropriated by Apple.
Well, it wasn't appropriated by Apple, it was made by Apple. It's based on the iPod, and then people started recording things that people went and listened to on their iPod. And instead of a radio cast or a broadcast, we had podcasts that go on your iPod. It is an Apple Central term. And I was not really comfortable with that, because Apple is among the worst of these companies that patent defensively and try to sue other companies for attempting to innovate.
Yes, it's really quite appalling when one researches the matter how many even very rudimentary kinds of innovations, technologies and methods that are prevalent in the market today, Apple is trying to claim an exclusive monopoly over and persecute.
I saw a patent the other day where Apple was attempting to patent a touch-to-click system.
Completely absurd. And
any touch screen, you need to touch to click. And Apple was attempting to patent it, I believe.
And even worse, of course, is the way Apple treats its own employees with its worldwide loyalty team and the spy cameras,
as it's often called.
Yes, the spy cameras at the workplace, and how nobody is allowed to tell other employees at Apple what project they're working on, and how they have to cover up all of the devices that they're working with on their workstations. Yes, and if anyone on the loyalty team finds out about a minor infraction,
worldwide loyalty team, indeed.
There's a brutal interrogation process, and
it can last many, many hours.
There are threats of exorbitant lawsuits, essentially a kind of blackmail for the employee. Before they terminate the employee, they make the employee promise not to follow up on that, not to question the termination, not to sue for wrongful termination. It's completely appalling what this company does to protect its, quote, intellectual property. Yeah. And I think this kind of abuse...
they're not state secrets. You know, it's a phone.
Yes, or an MP3 player. This kind of abuse is a prime example of the evils of an intellectual property system, the evils of a system that creates false property that doesn't arise out of nature, that doesn't arise out of physical, tangible goods that a human being can actually lay a legitimate claim to because they are scarce. And because they are scarce, there needs to be a mechanism of allocating them. With physical property, that mechanism is the principle of the first user. So if you take a piece of rock or a piece of wood out of the state of nature, it's not even because you've mixed your labor with it, as Locke argues. Stefan Kinsella argues that
he's amazing.
Stefan Kinsella argues that it's because you're the first user of this item taken out of the state of nature that you have a legitimate claim to it, and then you can trade with other people for it, and they can obtain legitimate rights to it. But with ideas, there's no need for an allocation mechanism because ideas aren't scarce.
Right. Ideas are actually the most plentiful thing we have. There will never be scarcity of ideas unless everyone dies out. Ideas are the one thing that's free to reproduce. It's not difficult to pass an idea on to someone else. Not to disparage teachers, but passing knowledge is much easier than something like building a car.
Yes, and actually, this is very important to realize in the electronic age, where it's so easy to convey ideas in media. I mean, anyone who wants to, and by the way, you're welcome to do this, and I hope you are going to do this, can take the MP3 file of this audio broadcast and spread it to as many entities as this person wishes. And please do this.
Put it anywhere you like. Make derivative works. Just as long as you refer back to the original, you can do whatever the heck you want. This is part of the Creative Commons license. Everything we do is Creative Commons.
Yes, and why do we want to do this? Because we recognize the realities of the internet era. We can no longer maintain an artificial stranglehold on human creativity,
we're
including our own.
we're no longer a read-only culture. There's this book called The Authenticity Hoax that we read recently.
By Andrew Potter.
Andrew Potter. Wonderful book. Excellent. And one of the arguments he posits is that we used to be, for about the 20th century, a read-only culture. Before that and after that, we've been a read-write culture. That is a culture where you can appropriate items from the general sum of knowledge to yourself and build on them. And this is a much more constructive and fast-growing method of idea dispersal. On the internet, of course, you see it in the form of memes. You see it in the form of remix videos and things like that. But heck, even Shakespeare was a derivative artist. All of his storylines he borrowed from previous playwrights, sometimes right down to the names and figures of speech. And that surprises a lot of people because Shakespeare was one of our great poets, but if he'd been writing in the 20th century with that kind of intellectual property right law, he might have not been nearly as prolific and probably wouldn't have produced the same kind of stuff.
Yes. One other canard that a lot of people bring up is that, well, you need intellectual property to reward the creators of these works.
It actually backfires.
Yes, that's clearly not true. And I think these people's focus is limited on the very big-name creators. What they don't realize is, even in an intellectual property regime, having a C with a circle next to your work doesn't guarantee that it will sell. Indeed, most books sell in a mediocre manner. They sell a couple thousand copies, maybe, at best.
That's pretty successful. I'd be thrilled if I sold 1,000 prints of any of my artwork.
Mm-hmm. You deserve to, of course, but as a result, a lot of these works are out of print now. Actually, Jeffrey Tucker...
My art isn't out of print. You can get as many prints as you want.
Yeah. Jeffrey Tucker of the Mises Institute has given quite a few speeches about trying to recover some of these older works that have gone out of print and reinvigorate them via a creative license and free publication on the Mises Institute website.
I mean, it's so easy now to take something like that, put it in PDF format, and distribute it on something like Project Gutenberg, which is an amazing source for things that are in the public domain now.
Mm-hmm. But he had a lot of trouble getting the rights to some of these works because they were copyrighted, and the publishing companies didn't want to give those rights away, even though these books were not being produced. And I think that's an excellent bridge into defensive patenting, because what happens with these copyrights of out-of-print works is the same thing, in essence, that happens with defensive patents, patents that just sit in the files of these enormous government-subsidized corporations.
They're not all government-subsidized. Many of them are just jerks. Places like Apple and even to some degree Microsoft, Sony does a lot of it. These places that patent things that they aren't using just to prevent anyone else from using them, preventing them from getting an unfair edge.
Yes.
Which is tremendously ironic, of course, because how unfair is it to patent an idea that you're not even using?
It's appalling how much technology sits unused when it could be contributing to progress and standards of living and human flourishing and fulfillment, and it's just sitting there.